welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, as you know, last week I went to see the new movie Logan and I absolutely loved it. And like all good movies, they stay with you for a few days afterwards, and Logan was no exception. And over the weekend, when I was thinking about the movie Logan, it suddenly dawned on me that I think there are actually 6 ways that the studio could now go on to do major harm and could really undermine this film in ways that aren't good. Now, you might be thinking, well, how can that be? The film's already been released. We've already seen a great movie. Yes, that's true, but there are plenty of other ways that you can go on after a great movie has been released to really do damage and harm to that legacy. So here's the 6 ways that I think that damage could be done. And obviously, for those of you who are wondering, yes, this discussion is definitely going to contain spoilers. The first thing I think the studios could do wrong would be to create a sequel that starts almost immediately after the end of Logan. So a film that starts with events that just pretty much pick up and carry on where we left off. This film, I don't think you can do that with this film without causing all sorts of issues. So what I'd be really interested in seeing is actually a sequel that maybe took place 20 or 30 years into the future with that group of young child mutants who are now fully grown adult mutants who have formed their own new X-Men force and who are now based in Canada and who are sort of keeping the world safe from there. Now that would be interesting, because basically you're far enough away from the events of Logan for it not to start interfering with some of the things that were so good about Logan. And one of the things that was good about Logan was that the child mutant characters, they really played an important role in servicing the film and servicing the actual plot. In other X-Men movies, the mutant characters have actually often, they've just sort of been jammed in there for like eye candy or fan service, and it hasn't really served the plot very well at all. As in this movie, they actually got the balance right. But if you go back and you make a movie now about those child mutants and you make them the focus, that's going to have a bearing on Logan as well. And I think it's far better to treat Logan effectively as 2 things. Number 1, it's closing up, it's the wrapping up of a legacy. It's bringing an end to that original X-Men franchise, which has well and truly run its course now. And it's also creating a unique little origins tale for a future X-Men force. But you don't need to know every little detail between now and, say, 20 or 30 years in the future when that X-Men force becomes a reality. I think in order to protect this movie and to sort of keep Logan the great cinematic experience that it was, I think the studios need to put a chronological bubble around this film and say, right, future films, prequels and sequels cannot come within 25 years distance of this movie. You cannot make a sequel that starts straight away after Logan has ended. You cannot make a prequel that happens just in the days leading up to Logan. We don't want to see that sort of stuff. Leave this film as it was. It's a great piece of standalone cinema. If you go interfering with it in these ways, I think it's really going to start to undermine what was so good about the way in which the plot was constructed for this movie. The next thing I think the studio could get wrong would be to reuse in a major way the villains from the movie Logan. Now, as 1 or 2 of you have pointed out to me, you felt that the villains in Logan were just really not up to snuff. They weren't good enough because they weren't supervillains. But I actually disagree. I think that what made them work so well in this was the fact that they weren't supervillains. And what that did was it really highlighted to you how frail and vulnerable these X-Men characters, Professor X and Logan, had now become. The whole point of this film is to show you characters who are at the end of their sort of strength and capabilities. They are at the end of their life cycle. And the way to do that is by actually having characters who are vulnerable to things that they wouldn't normally be vulnerable to. Like, on a good day, Logan, let alone Professor X, would have dispatched with these villains in a heartbeat, but they couldn't do that in this movie. And that's the whole point. If these villains were supervillains, it would have undermined all that. If they'd been able to hold their own against supervillains, it would have sort of undermined the whole point of the film. It would have been like, well, they're clearly not that weak and vulnerable then because they're able to fight off supervillains. But the fact that they were struggling to fight off just ordinary human bad guys really shows you and hammers home to you in a very subtle but powerful way how weak and vulnerable and how real the stakes now are in this film. So I think, though, going back and reusing these villains in other movies wouldn't work. They were perfectly serviceable. They were ideal. They were exactly what you needed in Logan. But if you go and take these villains and you put them into other X-Men films, that's just not going to work. It's actually going to undermine what they were in this movie, I think, for starters, because I can't see that ever being anything but a bad thing. I think they're going to end up with inferior versions of these villains. They have the perfect sort of balance of menace and threat and everything else in this movie. If you go sticking these characters into other films, I think a lot of that risks being undermined. And there's, apart from perhaps little Easter eggs where someone passes someone in a hallway in another movie and you go, oh, that's the guy from Logan, you really don't want to see these villains again, I don't think, because they won't work, for starters, and secondly, I think it will actually do damage to how effective they were in the movie Logan. The next thing I think the studios could get wrong would be to bring back Professor X. They've already done it, and this movie got away with it. And Logan got away with it for two reasons. Logan got away with it because, number one, it was such an excellent film. And Patrick Stewart just acted the bloomin' backside off this thing. He was phenomenal. So it was so well written, so well crafted, so well acted that, you're willing to forgive the fact that Professor X is now back again. Secondly, they obviously altered the timeline. But they've had that get out of jail free card now. They cannot reuse it. They cannot bring him back. If they bring him back, it will undermine so much of what was great about this movie. Remember Professor X's final day? He spent his final hours experiencing the joys of family life with that family. He was surrounded by a couple of mates. He was enjoying life with this family. And there's that beautiful monologue he gives in his before his death scene, in which he talks about how he didn't think this was so deserved, and it was such a beautiful moment for him. And then, just like in real life, out of nowhere, tragedy and evil strikes and does great harm, and you weren't even expecting it to happen, and it does this great damage. And all of this just the speech is so profound and so beautiful because he's a frail, aging, and obviously dying man, and it's made even more powerful by his death. His death that sort of comes out of nowhere and is so sudden, and it seems so sort of horrific, and it robs us of this great character. It really amplifies how beautiful and profound that moment, that little monologue was. But if you bring him back in a future film, all of that gets undermined. Because you'll watch that in future outings and you'll go, oh yeah, he's coming back though. And you see how that completely undermines. So he's talking about the joy of these final moments, this final day that he had. Well, it doesn't really mean anything if he's going to have lots more days in the future as well. And the whole sort of finality and brutal way his death is sort of visited upon him, that will all be completely undermined as well. So they have really got to avoid, and they're going to have to fight this, I think, the impulse or the urge, the temptation to bring back Professor X, but they cannot bring back Professor X. That would be a really big no-no for this film. The next thing I think the studios could get wrong would be to release an extended edition DVD or a special director's cut DVD with all sorts of added scenes that were not in the original film. This is one of those occasions where the cinematic version of a film is just really good, and I cannot see there being another version of this that would be any better. Well, I could be wrong. There might be some miracle cut sitting on a studio floor somewhere, which if they released, you would just go, wow, this is the most mind-blowing film that's ever made. But the simple fact is, why risk it? You have this amazingly phenomenal, in fact, Oscar-worthy film is what you've got here, certainly in the acting department. Why would you risk that by putting out some sort of special edition DVD or Blu-ray which chucks in a whole lot of extra footage into the film when it's totally not necessary? Now, Batman v Superman had the exact opposite problem. The studios butchered the film, took half an hour out of it, and they took probably the most vital half an hour was removed from that movie. And so the theatrical release was nowhere near as good as the actual original intended film that the director made. And so it was important that they put that original film out because that really redeemed and salvaged the problems that existed within the first movie. Even though I enjoyed the theatrical version, I think it elevated it, made it a completely different film. This movie, I think the exact opposite would happen. Now, the studios are going to be tempted to do this because studios love making money, and in their studio brains, they're going to go, we've got to give the fans more of what they want. Let's chuck more footage in there, and that'll give them another reason to buy this thing. There already is a million good reasons to buy this film when it comes out on Blu-ray and DVD. You do not need to add to it. And if you do add to it, I think that it's almost certain that you're going to end up with an inferior version of the film, not something better. I could be wrong, but I strongly suspect in this case, why would you muck around? Why would you take that gamble? The next thing I think the studios could get wrong would be to go and make prequels or a prequel about the events that are depicted or talked about and briefly mentioned in the movie Logan. We don't need to see a whole prequel film about that child mutant experimentation facility. We don't need to see that. We have been given all the information that we need about that facility, and it was given in those little shaky cam things and the flashbacks and stuff. We don't need to know any more information. We don't need to be bombarded and saturated with that sort of prequel type information. We don't need to see prequel films about that disastrous event that Professor X keeps referring to that he's responsible for. We don't need to see that. We don't need to see a prequel which shows us the days or weeks leading up to how Logan became a limo driver. We don't need to see any of that kind of stuff. All that does, I think, is actually undermines why it was so good in this film, because it was used to service the plot. We were given the information we needed and no more. It wasn't there because they wanted to give us some glamorous X-Men or film moment. It was there because it was there to service the story, and we were given exactly what we needed. If you go back and add to that now, though, and just add on whole big blocks of story, you're actually effectively interfering with this film, and I don't think you're going to get a good outcome by doing it. It really doesn't work. It's what I sometimes call the George Lucas syndrome. Think about what he did in the prequels. You have this great trilogy. It's almost perfect trilogy with A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. And then he goes back and makes the prequels. And the prequels basically are bombarded with this idea you've got to show and give people more of the Star Wars stuff. They want to see more of the stuff. And so think of the Phantom Menace. We were given a child Darth Vader, a child Anakin Skywalker. We didn't need to see that, and it actually ruined what was a great villainous character. That child character, that child Anakin Skywalker in Phantom Menace, which was the worst of all the prequel films, was a disaster. Not just for the Phantom Menace, it was a disaster for the actual original trilogy and how it undermined that. And the thing is, once it's out there, you can't unsee it. It can't be undone. So the studios need to, as I said, erect this sacrosanct bubble, chronological bubble around this film and just say we're not going to touch it. We're not going to jam other story points that relate to Logan directly and in a big way into their own prequel films. That would not be a good thing. And the last thing I think the studios could do wrong, and I think this would be the biggest mistake of all, would be to resurrect Logan. Logan is dead, and I think he has to stay dead. Now, yes, I accept that he's probably going to turn up in other X-Men movies that are sort of part of this prequel alternate timeline thing, but Logan cannot be resurrected in the same sort of timeline. He cannot be resurrected in a subsequent film that follows on from this movie. You can't bring him back. And the reason I don't think you can bring him back is because the closure that that character was given was just excellent in this film. And secondly, and even more importantly, the way in which the story is constructed. His sacrifice, Logan's sacrifice, is central to his character arc. It is central to the real guts, the meat and potatoes, the strength of what made this film so good. He starts the movie as this very self-centered character. Effectively, he has gone full circle. He's back to where he was in the very first X-Men movie. He's the self-centered guy who he's made sort of a couple of brief exceptions to allow certain people into his life, but no more. And he's stuck in this selfishness. Now, I know some of you pointed out the fact that this adamantium bullet was kind of a werewolf trope, you know, the silver bullet that kills the werewolf, and he's got this adamantium bullet, and you were sort of frustrated about how that played out. But I actually think it was a really great piece of storytelling, a great piece of filmmaking, because that little simple adamantium bullet actually symbolised the whole character arc. It was a symbol, a very powerful little symbol, which showed you the character arc that he went on. At the beginning of the movie, that adamantium bullet was a symbol of his selfishness. The reason it was there and in the film was because he was planning to use it to commit suicide with it. It's the ultimate act of selfishness, right? But by the end of the film, that adamantium bullet has become part of Logan's self-sacrificial and heroic and world-saving act. You know, he gives of himself to save the world, and the adamantium bullet is part of that. And it basically shows this whole trajectory this character has been on in this massive character arc. But what gives all of that substance is the fact that Logan actually dies. There's genuine sentimentality in this film. There's genuine heart to that sacrifice. But if you bring him back in future movies, even if it's some sort of silly, we plucked some DNA from the ground and we've resurrected him, even if it's that, it will undermine the sacrifice. It will basically make it meaningless. It renders it moot. And you don't want to do that, because that will do great harm to what Logan actually was, what made this film so good. It doesn't work. We've seen it before. It doesn't work. Think about the movie Equilibrium, which has a sort of mini form of resurrecting a character. So Tom Cruise's character does this great act of heroic self-sacrifice on the alien spaceship, and then lo and behold, the Tom Cruise clone turns up, who looks exactly like Tom Cruise, who's effectively is the same character. It's just an alternate version of the same character, turns up to give the movie a happy ending. But what it does is it actually undermines the sacrifice. It sort of feels like Tom Cruise didn't really sacrifice anything, because there's a Tom Cruise clone back at the end. And that temptation to give a happy ending just overrode really good storytelling concerns, and it weakened the movie as a result. Another classic example of this, where they brought a character back, was in the movie Aliens. Remember Ripley? Her ending was really powerful, and despite the fact that Alien 3 had its problems, the ending to that film was really powerful. It was just the sort of searing final moment of Ripley's life and her character. It was almost had this sort of tragic overtones to it and everything. But then they bring her back. And it becomes this sort of thing. Now you watch that movie subsequently now, and when you go back and watch Alien 3, it's like, oh yeah, she's coming back though. And you see her completely rips the guts out of how great the strength of that moment, regardless of the problems in Alien 3. And not only that, but when they brought her back in the subsequent film, they gave her these new character traits, and they gave her a whole new tone to what she'd had in previous films that actually undermined the original character. It really started to impinge upon the original strength and the original properties of that first version of the character. And I think they would probably end up doing the same here with Wolverine. I think the best thing to do is just to leave him dead. What they need to do, as I said, is treat Wolverine as sacrosanct, put a chronological bubble around it, and to say, okay, he's dead now, this was the closure of one chapter, let's pick up the next chapter 25, 30 years later and create a new X-Men force. And we will all think, wow, that was great. And remember that moment in Logan, which actually kicked this all off? It will be this great origins tale, kind of like Unbreakable was, this origins tale that really was so much more than that. And it will be just one of the best superhero origins films that you've ever seen, as well as being a great closure for an existing legacy. But if you bring him back, I think it completely undermines all of that, and it does such great harm to the legacy. So there you go, that's my ideas. Those are the 6 things I think the studios could do wrong that would really damage and undermine the greatness of Logan. Maybe I've missed some stuff. Let me know if you think there's anything else the studios could do. Now, I've got to be honest, I'm not particularly hopeful about this, because as soon as it became apparent that Logan was this amazing film and that was really going to have a really big impact on audiences, you could hear, figuratively speaking, you could hear the cogs already turning in studio executives' minds. You could hear the cash registers ringing, and as I said, I'm not hopeful. I think what they're going to do is typically what studios tend to do, and they're going to go, wow, this made money. How do we make more money off this thing? Let's make other things and stick them to the side of this thing, and let's exploit this thing, and it's a cash cow. Let's milk it dry. And I think in doing that, they're actually going to really undermine what was a great and phenomenal piece of filmmaking. I hope I'm wrong. My hope is that what the studios actually do is they say, you know what, let's leave this movie alone. It's a great piece of art. Let's respect the artistic merit of something for once, instead of thinking just about making money. And let's go and find other ways that have nothing to do with Logan to make lots of other money by actually allowing and hopefully learning from this Logan experience and saying, you know what, let's get other talented filmmakers and let's give them the creativity that James Mangold had, and let's see what they can do with some of our other X-Men properties to produce really good and artistically strong films. Because if we do that, then you'll make money. In fact, you'll make more money than Disney is making with the Marvel Cinematic Universe if you produce a string of really good, well-made and creatively sound films about the X-Men. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.